as a serious runner, the taper is something that I take very seriously. It's important to stay off my feet. I'll lounge on my couch like I'm in a Tracksmith catalog and watch replays of Breaking 2 and 159 Project.
Well, apparently woodworkers aren't the only ones that do tapers. Welcome to Flynndogg Woodwork. Today we're going to take a look at 3 different tapering jigs that I think might be a beneficial addition to your shop. So let's not waste any time and start talking about tapers. So before we dig into these jigs, we first need to understand what a taper is. Now, a tapering cut is something that you don't run into every day in woodworking. However, the longer you stay in this craft, the more you realize it pops up quite frequently. In fact, I distinctly remember the first time I encountered this cut, and it was actually with a home improvement project. Now, although a little bit difficult to see, it was this cut right here. This is a really shallow angle, and it was very difficult to cut over at the table saw. And I'm guessing I freehanded that cut.
You an idiot?
Which is one of the most dangerous cuts you can make at a table saw. In fact, it's so dangerous it should never be done. I took my piece of wood and ran it through the table saw, having only the support of both my hands on either side of that blade. This is almost certainly a recipe for disaster with a kickback. Now you may be saying, why didn't you just do that cut over at the miter saw? That's what the miter saw is for.
Yeah, that's just what I was thinking.
The problem is, even miter saws with huge cutting capacities don't have the reach to make those cuts on shallower angles. And I know for a fact I wasn't dealing with this fancy miter saw, I was dealing with a Ryobi that only had a 12-inch cut capacity and wasn't a sliding miter saw. And that's what brings us to this video today. We're going to take a look at 3 different tapering jigs, 2 of which I've had for quite a while, and a brand new one, and take a look at all their features. Now, the first tapering jig we're going to take a look at today is the one that I've had the longest. This is the Rockler Tapering Jig. Now, this comes in a couple of different sizes, but today we're going to take a look at the larger one. So this jig is probably one of the more popular jigs that you're going to see out there on YouTube, and that's initially why I purchased this tool. Let's take a closer look at how this thing is put together. So as I said before, this is the larger of the 2 Rockler tapering jigs, and this comes in at a length of approximately 32 inches. Now, the width of this jig is entirely dependent on the type of table saw you're using. It will initially come at approximately 8 inches wide, but you'll cut it down so it fits your table saw perfectly. So the first thing that you'll do once you assemble this jig is you'll slide it into your miter slot and you'll cut off that excess width by running it through the table saw. And this is quite nice because there'll essentially be no gap between the blade of your table saw and the jig. Therefore, you can use the freshly cut edge of this jig as a reference point to make all of your cuts. If we look at the underside of the jig, you can see there's a 3/4 inch miter bar that's attached to the jig with 3 screws. You'll also notice that the miter bar extends past the front of the jig by 4 inches. The entirety of this jig, aside from the hardware, is made out of MDF, which is nice because it really allows you to make those precision cuts. On the support bar that runs the length of the jig, you'll notice that there's 2 clamps that hold your workpiece in place as you run it through your table saw. And these clamps are held in place with T-bolts that run along the back side of the support bar. If we look at the right-hand side of the jig, you'll notice that there's a very convenient handlebar that allows you to push this jig through the table saw. You'll also notice 3 holes that allow you to move the miter bar a little bit closer in case you're dealing with a smaller table saw. Lastly, let's take a look at how we adjust this tapering jig. If we look at the front of the jig, you'll notice that there's a little ruler that goes from 0 all the way up to about 7 1/4. Once you have this in place, you simply lock it down with a knob on top. On the back side of the jig, it's very similar, only you'll notice one extra feature on the very end of that support bar. You'll notice the same yellow tape measure as well as some indexing holes. It also has the locking knob on this side as well. But on this end, there's also the metal support bar. This is used to support your workpiece as you push it through the table saw. And depending on how tight of a taper you're doing, you can adjust the support bar to give you the support you need. Now, all those indexing holes and tape measures are great, but 99% of the time, I find myself referencing a line I struck on my workpiece. So what are the limitations with this jig? Well, in my opinion, there's really only 2. The first limitation has to do with the most aggressive angled cut that you can make with this jig. If I have the very back of the jig pushed all the way to the left so that it still gives support to my workpiece, and the very front pushed all the way to the right, I can take my T-bevel to determine that angle. And you can see from my measurement, the most aggressive angle is right at about 8.5 degrees. And that is a-okay for the majority of my tapers. Most of my tapers are for things like tabletop legs that don't have aggressive angles. The second limitation with this jig is you can only use it on the right-hand side of your table saw blade. Since this is a jig that has a miter bar and is cut down to size, you can't simply flip the jig around and use it in the other direction. You can see there's way too much of a gap there.
It doesn't work that way.
Not to mention the handle's in a very awkward position in this configuration and you can't move the metal support bar from one end to the other. So don't even try that. I think that's a recipe for disaster.
Bad idea.
But in its correct position, this can be a great jig to create those subtle tapers. If you guys haven't already, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. It really does help out this small woodworking channel. Only about 11% of the people that watch my videos are actually subscribed. Also, just like with all my videos, if you're interested in any of these jigs, I'll leave links in the description below so you can go check them out for yourself. Well, that takes us through our first tapering jig, and that's a jig I've relied upon for quite a few years. Now let's move on to our second jig, which is brand new to me. And this jig addresses one of those limitations that we saw with the Rockler Jig. So let's dig into this new jig. So this jig is the Fulton Tapering Jig. Let's unbox this one and see how it compares. We've got a slight problem here. I'm not sure we can open this. This is apparently a finished product, and it says right here, do not open.
What does that even mean?
I should have gone to marketing school. So I took the risk and I opened the box anyway. As you can see, it comes with the instructions, the jig itself, a sliding bracket, as well as a handle and some hardware. Now there is some assembly required for this jig, so I'm going to do that right now. Well, that wasn't too bad. This was a heck of a lot easier to assemble than that Rockler Jig. Now, one difference between this jig and the Rockler Jig is this jig is almost made entirely out of aluminum versus the Rockler, which has a heck of a lot of MDF. So if you do have something like a saw stop, you just want to be cognizant of that, as this thing will definitely carry a current. So let's take a closer look at this jig and see how it compares to that Rockler. So one of the first things that I noticed when putting this tool together was how smooth the finish was on this tool. This will easily slide against your table saw fence and the tabletop of your table saw. The next thing that I noticed is that there's no yellow ruler or indexing holes with this tool, but instead there's another measuring feature that I think is just a little bit better. This tool instead has an indexing feature showing inches to feet going from 0 to 3 inches, as well as degrees going from 0 degrees all the way up to 15 degrees. So as you adjust your jig, you can see your degree measurement or inches to feet. The adjustments for this jig are easily done by loosening and tightening wing nuts. By loosening the wing nut on the right, you can easily adjust this jig all the way from 0 degrees up to 15 degrees. Once you have your desired angle in place, you'll lock it down by tightening the wing nut. And once that wing nut is locked down, this thing is very secure. If we look at the end of the jig, you'll notice a 1-inch support bracket on the very end. This will give support to your workpiece as you push it through the table saw. You'll also notice a handle on the opposite end, as well as another screw on the opposite side of the jig to adjust your handle if you're using this jig on the left-hand side of your table saw blade. And that's really where this jig shines. You can make a couple of adjustments to the jig to be able to use it on the left-hand side of your table saw blade. Not only can you move the handle to the opposite side of the jig, but you can also move the support bracket to the opposite side as well, with the 2 holes that are on the other end of the jig. So you can use this jig with its normal placement on the right-hand side of the blade, or you can make some adjustments and use it on the left-hand side. Now ideally, this jig is meant to be used with larger pieces of material, and that's because the support bar is 1 inch wide. Therefore, your piece needs to be at least 1 inch thick. So if you're dealing with wider pieces of stock, this jig might be a better option. Now, although this jig can accommodate larger stock and more aggressive angles, there are a couple of things that I don't like about this jig. And most of those are kind of a give and take for the ability to have this jig on either side of the blade. The first issue is, since this tool doesn't use a miter bar, you need to make sure that you're applying pressure towards the fence at all times. The second issue is the handle is just a little bit too close to the fence and not quite tall enough. This makes it a little bit difficult to hold when you're pushing your lumber through the table saw. The final issue is the miter slot. You can get into a situation in some of your thinner rips where this tool will actually fall into the miter slot. But each one of those issues are trade-offs for the ability to use this jig on either side of the blade. And when used properly, this could be a very valuable table saw accessory. Well, that covers our first 2 tapering jigs, and now it's time to dive into our third jig. And our last jig is way more than a tapering jig. It's actually an entire jig system. But by making a simple jig for this jig system, yes, that's a lot of jigs, you can have the ultimate tapering jig. So what is this system? Well, you've probably heard of it. It's the Dovetail Matchfit system made by Microjig. So what comes with this system? Well, let's take a look at it. So it really couldn't be more simple. This set comes with a dovetail bit as well as 2 clamps. Now in my case, I went with a 1/2 inch bit, but it also comes in 1/4 inch shanks. But the real power with this tool isn't about the tools themselves, but the jigs that you make for these tools. And last year in this video here, I made this jig system. And if you're interested in learning how to make this jig, you can go check out that video. So what is this jig I made? Well, let's go check it out. So there is nothing complicated about this jig. This is simply a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that I took that dovetail bit and routed out these horizontal and vertical lines. Once you have those horizontal and vertical lines routed out of your wood, it's then time to grab the clamps and see the real magic of this system. You see, if we look at the tips of the clamp, you can see they have a dovetail profile to them.
It's called just the tip.
It's that dovetail profile that allows you to slide these clamps into any of those dovetails that you cut out with your router. And whether you're sliding these clamps either into the horizontal or vertical slots, you can easily slide these clamps into place. To use this jig, you'll simply nestle your wood in between the table saw blade and the table saw fence. So you'll take your jig and you'll rest it gently against the table saw blade, and then you can move your fence over on the opposite side of the jig. Once you have your jig sandwiched in between the blade and the fence, you now have unlimited possibilities for the angles for your tapers. And you can legitimately cut subtle tapers, aggressive tapers, 90-degree cuts, or anywhere in between. And not only that, just like our previous tapering jig, you can use this on either side of the blade. By simply flipping the jig around and moving the table saw fence, you can have this on the left-hand side of the blade. And that's what's made this tapering jig one of my favorites over the last year, as the flexibility with this jig is really unmatched. Well, I want to thank you today for joining me on checking out each one of these unique tapering jigs. Each one of these has some interesting features that I think was worth taking a look at. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. It really does help out this small woodworking channel. Until next time, take care as always.